Can I start by saying a very good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining. Bruce sends his apologies. He was hoping to be here, and he still hopes to be here before the end of the session, but he's in a virtual hearing at the moment and hasn't been able to get away. So he's asked me just to make, on his behalf, some brief introductory comments. So the LMAA, of course, is in the business of dispute resolution, and dispute boards can be one excellent way of resolving disputes. Now, I'm convinced that there's potentially a role for dispute boards to play in contracts with a maritime component, such as complex shipbuilding projects and construction for the offshore energy sector, and increasingly the wind sector within that. We've all seen the potential cost involved in disputes under major projects, particularly where there are numerous variation and warranty claims. So the LMAA is keen to be at the forefront of developments, and this initial session is intended to help us to understand what dispute boards are and how they work. One idea that's been mooted is that we might maintain a list of members willing to sit on dispute boards, rather like the list of mediators that we have. That and other ideas will be for consideration in due course. But for now, I'll hand over to Ben to introduce our speakers.
Thanks very much, David. Much appreciated. I'm Ben Goss, aspiring full member of the LMAA. Thanks very much for joining. Thanks to the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation for agreeing to host this event for us, and also to do it exclusively for the LMAA. It's all LMAA aspiring and full members here making up the audience. We also have John Halcrow and Nick Rigby, who have been sort of helping me and come from the offshore and the renewables sector and have an interest in it as I do, and they're members of the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation. So they're here with us as guest members. Otherwise, it's an exclusive event put on by the DRBF for us, the LMAA. So thank you very much for that. We're going to kick off initially with Anne Rousseau, who is the Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation. She will give a brief introduction to the DRBF and what they're all about, and we'll hand over to John Bishop, who was a senior partner with Pinsent Masons and is now a full-time arbitrator himself and dispute board practitioner. So John will give the bulk of today's presentation. We've left time, that will probably take about 30 minutes, and we've left time at the end for hopefully a healthy Q&A and discussion, at which point too we can bring in Simon Fagan, who is with us too and is responsible and involved with the DRBF on the training front. So Simon can fill it in more on the training sort of options that are laid on. So without further ado, I will hand over to Anne and let you kick us off. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As Ben mentioned, I am with the DRBF, and we are a worldwide association for all parties who are interested in the dispute board process. So that's project owners, contractors, attorneys, claims consultants, engineering consultants, as well as dispute board practitioners, the people who are serving on boards. So I'm joining you today from the US. I'm in North Carolina, but we do have a very diverse and robust membership in over 70 countries around the globe. So it's really nice to be able to connect with this particular group and share a little bit of information about the DRBF. As I mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1997 by the founder of the dispute board process and several colleagues that he had been working with. DRBs had been around for quite some years, having their origins in the tunneling industry, and felt that there was a need for a professional association to help elevate best practices and expand the use of the process to new sectors, which is a bit of what we're talking about today. We do have all of the normal things that you would expect from a professional association: a strong focus on promoting the process, a strong focus on education and training, and sort of elevating the practice through our code of ethical conduct and other programs. One thing that I'm particularly proud of is at the end of last year, we published an update to our dispute board manual, which I have here. And this document is available for free if you want to download it from our website to an e-reader. So if you have an iPad or Kindle or other reading device that you can download into, it is available for free. We do also sell the paper copy for those who like the tangible book in their hands, and you can get it off the Amazon UK site or any other retailer. But this is a really great overview of the process, and it gets into a lot of the recommendations that can help anyone who's new to the process understand both the business concept of dispute boards, why they work, how they work, as well as how to get started with one, whether you're putting it into a contract or serving on your first dispute board. We also have a very robust library of papers. So there are things that are specific. For example, we have some white papers on the use of dispute boards for PPP projects. And then there are others that are maybe geographic oriented, other industry sectors, and best practices in general. You'll note the last one, coordinating with other industry organizations, and we're really glad to be here with LMAA today. It's a good opportunity for some collaborative work. So I'm going to turn things over now to John Bishop, who will take you through Dispute Board 101. John?
Thank you, David and Ben. Thank you to the LMAA for allowing me to come along and come along at home and talk to you.
If I may, I'm not sure, is everyone hearing John okay? Because he's a bit quiet for me.
I will try and speak louder.
Yeah, I'm not sure where your microphone is. If you could maybe get a little bit closer to it, that may help.
Must be in my screen somewhere. I wouldn't
hopefully also on the user end, if you want to turn up your microphones to maximum capacity, then that may help as well.
Okay. Right. Well, I'll proceed ahead and try and be loud. It's a great privilege to talk to you today because I've been dealing with dispute boards for 25 years, I think. And I started off as a bit of a cynic about the whole process, and I've become a devotee, and I hope that my enthusiasm isn't too heavy, but I am a great enthusiast. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about just the basic things of dispute boards, and I'm going to go quite quickly, I hope, because it's more interesting for you to be able to discuss them at the end. So what is a dispute board? Well, it's a form of ADR, but unlike many ADR processes, because of the way it's structured, it has a dispute avoidance role. And this is really important. So what it's not mediation, it's not arbitration. And in some circumstances, which we'll come on to, the decisions of the dispute board may be binding and enforceable, either on a permanent basis or enforceable unless and until reviewed in arbitration. So a cost-benefit analysis to start. It's a question of the fixed cost of the dispute board against the benefits. What are the considerations? Well, it is said that the carrying cost is between 0.5% to 0.15% of project costs. If it's a very big project, of course, it goes even lower. And one of the important elements is that dispute boards work within the management structure. And I tell people when I start off, I want them to think of me as part of the management of the project, not as some mini arbitration on the side. So dispute board members will attend meetings on site. They don't stay, well, they will when they're allowed to again, I suppose, after this current problems. But it's really important in my industry, the work where I work in construction, that you've got your hard hat and your boots ready to go on site and be part of the management team. And because of its informal nature as part of the management structure, in its dispute resolving process, there is much less use of external consultants and lawyers because, as we'll go into a little more detail in a moment, because you're in the real-time flow of documents. We don't need to have discovery and all that stuff in order for the dispute board to do its job. And it does it in the real time of the project. I'm going to go over a few of those things again in a minute, but that's some of the key things. Here's a case study done by the Florida Department of Transportation. It's a little bit old, 2013. But if you look on the left at projects with dispute boards, on the right without, and the things to contrast, I think, are that the time overruns on projects with dispute boards were 1.8%, contrasting with 19.2% on non-DB contracts. And the cost overruns were about 12.1% on contracts with DBs, whereas it's 17.9% on non-DB contracts. I think if that was run today, you would find even a bigger contrast because people doing the DB job have become much more experienced and honestly can improve upon even those figures. Other benefits. Well, as I try to say, there's a collaborative behavior. What the dispute board does is it meets with people and it talks about their problems. It has a communication process, which means that it's not stepping in like, for example, an adjudicator sometimes does in the adjudication process, which many of you may know happens in construction industries around the world now, but in the UK started, where sometimes the heavy adjudication process actually wrecks contractual relationships. One of the jobs of the dispute board is to preserve those contractual relationships. And it can do so because it gets involved early on at a stage when parties haven't got into those horrible entrenched positions. It can actually make a resolution easier. It can be managed in an orderly and, of course, in a neutral manner. And it's resolution when the project needs it, not later when it's more difficult to retrace the steps. So it can resolve projects as we go along. In a minute, we're going to talk about the timescales, but I can tell you, I've been involved in a dispute board who resolved a problem in 36 hours. The project could go on. The outcomes that the dispute board should respect and maintain the contract provisions. We're not people who go in and say, well, it'd be a bit fairer if the contract did this or the contract did that. Of course, you're working within the contract and within the contractual allocation of risk. But looking at the merits, both factual, technical, legal merits, you can maintain this integrity and this procedural fairness. And it's based on the factual records. As I've said a moment ago, the dispute board will get the actual records of the project as it's going along and will review them as they come in on the email. And of course, they will have to have some knowledge of the applicable law they're going to apply to the project. When they have to make a decision, when they give a finding, they do so in a reasoned and detailed way so that the parties understand where they're coming from. I can give you an example of a dispute board that I chaired in the Middle East, where after about 3 findings, the parties wrote saying, we know where you're coming from now. We're not going to put these disputes to you because you've already made clear your approach to some of these critical issues. So what is a dispute board and how does it work? This is, look, you can have as many anachronisms for dispute boards as you like, and here are 5 of them. They're all just dispute boards. There is a thing called the Dispute Review Board, very popular in America, and they do not give findings, they give non-binding recommendations. And they are, as I say, immensely popular. They're institutionalized in parts of the United States. There's this Dispute Avoidance and Adjudication Board. We used to just call it the Dispute Adjudication Board, but in recent times, to recognize the roles that dispute board members have taken on, the key document we're going to come to in a minute, the FIDIC contract, has actually done this rebranding. And the parties can ask for informal assistance, and I'm going to tell you in a minute that even before they ask, sometimes the DB is giving that assistance, and they can come to binding decisions when needed. Then there's the Combined Dispute Board. Originally, I think the baby of the International Chamber of Commerce, which actually combines these ideas of recommendations and decisions, and the parties can agree, the dispute board's there all along, but the parties can agree as they go along whether they need binding decisions or recommendations. And the dispute board can influence which it thinks they should be getting. And then dispute resolution experts, dispute resolution advisors, usually when it's a one-man board. Two types of dispute board commonly in use. One is the ad hoc dispute board on the left. This is a dispute board which is formed only after a dispute is crystallized. So it gives binding decisions, we'll come to the timetable in a minute, but quick binding decisions during the course of the contract. But because it's not there at the time the dispute started, it doesn't really have any opportunity for the dispute avoidance role. What has become more popular is the standing dispute board. This is a dispute board formed at the start of the contract. As this says, it goes regularly to site. It has meeting with the parties. Very often, my dispute boards, we didn't have dinner with the parties as well, so we get to know each other well. We remain involved with the progress all the way through the project, and we can give our informal opinions, but when a binding decision is necessary, we give it. So it's a permanent board for the entirety of the project, able to also promote dispute avoidance. So a standing dispute board. It's a dispute board. Obviously, a key element of all of this is that the members are impartial. They are formed at the beginning of the project and they follow the construction process I've described. And as I've said, they encourage this dispute avoidance, but they will assist with or actually resolve disputes as necessary. Absolutely what's key about these professionals, they've got to be somebody who the members, the participants of the project recognize as being people of some stature whose views they really are going to listen to and take into account. That's really important. Here we are. So essential characteristics, as I've said, independent. You will, when you're appointed to a dispute board, you will sign a contract to be a member, and you will confirm your independence at that time, that you will maintain it throughout your appointment. And the same with your impartiality. Experience is essential. You have to be able to say to the party, oh, well, I've seen that once before, you know, when I last saw that, the way I think it got resolved was this. You've got to get that confidence up. Where you have a 3-person board, this can go wrong. You do not want to have 3 lawyers. You do not want to have 3 engineers, because I have direct experience as a solicitor of this, a case with 3 engineers, an extremely complicated legal issue arose. So you do want to have this blend. Very often in my world of construction, it would be maybe an engineer, maybe a quantity surveyor, and maybe a lawyer. And as I say, the other essential characteristic is their proactivity. The main functions, well, at the start, you will agree with the parties what documentation you're going to receive. And you will receive that basic set of documents that tell you about the legal nature of the project, the technical nature of the project, and all the other imperatives. So right at the start, there's a reading in task, and it's essential that dispute boards do that job. Thereafter, you keep up to date with progress, so you will agree the documents to be provided to you on a regular basis. Of course, all key documentation in the way of correspondence, of course, major site meeting minutes, of course, any notices or claims, but also some more routine stuff as they come through. And then the issue comes of this encouraging parties to resolve disputes before they become disputes. It is actually quite easy as an outsider, sometimes, not always, sometimes, to look at the technical stuff coming through or the legal stuff coming through and think, oh, there's going to be a problem coming up. And you can tactically say, how are we going to resolve this issue? And honestly, some people, I know a particular project of an airport project where a very experienced dispute board took the parties through, even spotted a fundamental design error before anybody else, and were able to say, I don't think that will fit alongside that. Can you tell me how you're going to do that? And everyone went, oh, thank God you're here. And of course, if there is a dispute, you can adjudicate it quickly so as not to disrupt the project. The ad hoc DB, as I said, it decides disputes that are already disputes. But in doing so, it also takes on some of those other things. It isn't just a kind of mini arbitration adjudication process. It is an ability to resolve disputes in a manner and in a style that preserves the key contractual relationships and preserves the project going forward. So although they don't have the dispute avoidance opportunity, although sometimes I have to say they do steal in there and say, by the way, if this kind of thing happens again, you might want to think about. But they are there as, again, part of the functioning of the project, even though only appointed later. As I said, the dispute avoidance, forgive me going over it again, but during the periodic meeting, the DB will review the status of any outstanding issues. It will try and spot those issues, and it will inquire about potential disputes and claims. Some contracts say the dispute board will give an opinion if the parties jointly ask them to do so. Very often dispute boards don't wait to get to that stage. They don't get to the answer to the disagreement or dispute. They're going to offer an opinion before that. But you can offer an opinion informally to the parties. And that can be much more valuable sometimes than having to go through a formal adjudication. But where you need to resolve disputes, it's done, as I've said, in real time, and that's critical. And it can be done in a formal dispute at the request of one party. But when I say formal, I have to tell you, I don't have hearings. I have meetings of the parties to resolve problems. And I don't have it conducted like some formal thing. I get the parties to discuss across the table with the dispute board at the end acting as chair. And very often the parties say, well, we've got an idea, we'll be back in an hour. So it's that kind of role that you can perform. A little bit of history. There's no point in me sitting here reading each of these lines. You can read them faster and better than me. But what I'd like to point out is FIDIC. Some of you may not have come across FIDIC. FIDIC is it's a fancy French title, which I won't try and remember. But FIDIC is the organization that publishes the most widely used contracts in the construction industry internationally. What's important on here is you'll see that of course, it's terribly important that the DRBF was formed, but above that, what's very important is that the World Bank made dispute boards mandatory. And it was particularly concerned by the number of projects that didn't get finished because, or that got terminated. And it realized that dispute boards are very strong in avoiding that problem. Then the Asian Development Bank and the European Bank in the 1997 climbed on the bandwagon, and the FIDIC contracts, they're called the Rainbow Suite because they're different colored contracts for different kinds of contracts: design and build, turnkey, traditional construction. They introduced in some of their contracts standing, and in some cases ad hoc dispute boards as part of the contract. And interestingly, the terms and conditions for appointment of the members are an appendix to those contracts. The ICC then produced its own dispute board rules, and the World Bank led a whole lot of multi-development banks to produce the MDP forms of contract, and they also have, of course, dispute boards. Recognizing the development, the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators produced dispute board rules in 2014, the ICC in 2015. In 2017, this is important, in 2017, FIDIC produced a new set of its colored contracts, and it decided to move from dispute adjudication boards, which it talked of before, to dispute avoidance and adjudication boards, to recognize two things. One, the opportunity for dispute avoidance, but also to recognize that experienced dispute board members were actually taking on that role. The NEC, another major contract used internationally, now includes dispute boards as an option, and as Anne's mentioned, I recommend to you the dispute board manual. Costs and benefits. Well, reasons to have a dispute board. I must say, this says disagreements and disputes can adversariously affect budgets and time for completion. In fact, they regularly do. Of course, when you have a dispute, the costs of that are not often refundable. But disputes do wreck the goodwill and the long-term relationships on the project. They, of course, tie up unnecessary resources. And what tends to happen in my industry is people build up claims for a massive arbitration at the end. Most of those claims could have been resolved during the course of the project. Costs, told you this before, said to be 0.05% to 0.15%. When selling dispute boards to my clients, when I used to be a solicitor, I used to say you have to think of this like insurance. This is an insurance premium, and gosh, it's good cover. It's much cheaper than the standard insurance when you think of the risks that it's covering for you. Importantly, because it's part of the management of the project, it's almost always the case the contract says that the cost will be shared equally between the parties. Benefits, well, I'm sorry for going over some things again, but let's just summarize them. Dispute board remains familiar with the project, it learns about it at the start, and keeps itself up to date. This dispute avoidance attitude is really important. Very interestingly, a very experienced dispute board member, Robert Gateskill, Dr. Robert Gateskill, he always tells how the parties get together the day before the dispute board attends the meetings and say, oh God, they're going to ask us about that again. We better find a solution. So very often it's done without the dispute board's interference even. The parties choose these dispute board members, they're their people, and it's usually said that they jointly choose them. One nominates one and the other agrees to it. It's cost efficient, maintains control over the outcome of the project, encourages good relations, and it's a confidential process. And the DB is proactive. Application worldwide, there's a nice map for you. Everything in red are places where there's dispute boards. Notable projects, well, please look at the list. You'll recognize so many of them. The one I like to see on that list is the Channel Tunnel, because I gave 5.5 years of my professional career to resolving the disputes on the Channel Tunnel. And what I will tell you is that, and I've been and got in print of this, and as have others, that project would certainly not have been completed as it was without the dispute board, certainly not. And indeed, there are some major international contractors that would not exist today were it not for that dispute board. Summary and conclusions. This is interesting. 2018, over 2,920 completed projects with dispute boards. Well, if those in 2018 were the completed projects, you can imagine the actual number of projects and the ones that got to the DRBF's attention. The actual number, of course, will be a lot bigger, and $280 billion US of projects. Impressive figures, I think. Are they effective? Well, they have a very high rate of success. That's my personal experience, but more importantly, the figures collected by the DRBF show that it's somewhere between 85 and 98% of matters which a dispute report resolves do not even go to the next stage. They don't go to arbitration or litigation. More importantly, actually, which of course we don't know the figures for, is how many projects have got finished that might have been terminated but for the dispute board. Conclusions. The records therefore show that very convincingly that a standing dispute board from the commencement of the project greatly assist in avoiding disputes and in all that wasted time, cost, and diversion from the real objective of the project of a costly dispute. And if you want an independent person, as opposed to somebody like me, who you may have now guessed is a bit of an enthusiast, the international funding agencies are absolutely convinced by this process. Initially, they just said it had to go in their contract. Now they check whether it's gone in the contract and is being used. And just to finish with a quote, you may know of Robert Aikenhead. Robert Aikenhead is a construction lawyer who has a great experience. Before he became a judge doing construction cases, he actually did, to my direct knowledge, a number of dispute boards. So he's a man who understands. And in this case, it's a complicated case I'm not going to go into, but we did make this absolutely helpful quote. And you can read it, but I'm going to read it too. Dispute review boards have become quite common on very substantial infrastructure type projects around the world, many of them involving hundreds of millions of dollars or more. DRBs can look at disputes as they emerge, make recommendations to the parties with a view to nipping it in the bud, such incipient disputes. He's a great authority, and that's a very good quote. Okay, I've got there just about in my 30 minutes.
Very good, John. Very good. We have had a few questions come in the chat, and Sarah asked a question that I would actually like to tie to something I wanted to ask you about as well, John. When you were talking about dispute board appointment of members, you mentioned a preference for a mix of engineers and attorneys, not all attorneys or all engineers. And I was going to ask you to comment on the fact that sometimes issues do come up that require the board to bring in an outside expert. So you use the example of there being a complex legal issue. Oftentimes dispute boards will have an attorney serving as the chair, but I wanted to ask you about commenting on the use of experts in something that might come up outside the expertise of the board. And then to tie that into Sarah's question, she was asking about sort of, is it a chicken and egg scenario? Because you mentioned the importance of the members having expertise and stature in the industry. And I think maybe the nuance there is that You need to have expertise in the work of the project being done, not necessarily in the dispute board industry, right? You do want to have training and understand how to implement a dispute board. But I think the key about experience is not that you've served on a lot of boards before, although that may be desirable for a chair, but that you have experience in the type of work being done. So maybe talk about the experience and then what to do when you face some challenges that you need to bring in an outside expert.
Okay. Yeah, you're quite right. I should have been more explicit about experience. This isn't a, God forbid, this isn't a club for a few people to make a lot of money being on dispute boards, or somebody anyway. The experience that actually is immensely valuable is to have people who are known to have done the kinds of projects you have in mind. Yes, it's normal to have a lawyer on the board, and I'm as a lawyer, I recommend it, but the lawyer has to have, obviously, a good detailed experience, I believe, in my industry of construction contracts and construction disputes. The other members have to have a good experience of working in the field of the particular project. So if it's a tunneling dispute, there probably isn't much help in having somebody who's an expert in train systems, unless the train goes through the tunnel. It's that kind of experience. I think the other thing one should say with experience is if you're trying to choose or asking people to recommend dispute board members, you do need people who have the right attitude to the process. If they're people, particularly can happen, we all know them, of people who are very judgmental of other people in their business, you do not want them on your dispute board. You don't want a member of the dispute board who's going to say, how could you possibly have done that? You want people on the dispute board say, oh, I understand that because I've been there before. And what about this then, etc. And ask the questions that get the confidence. Now, you're quite right, Sarah and Anne, to talk about what happens when an issue arises, probably a technical issue, which is beyond the direct knowledge of the dispute board members. Of course, that can happen. On a complicated project, that's very likely to happen. In my experience, when that happens, the most common approach is that the parties who come to put the views to the dispute board actually do have the expertise to explain it to them. But I have been on dispute boards where one or both parties have brought along somebody who's an expert outside of their business and who explains. And that can be really helpful, but it's up to the chair of the dispute board to grab that immediately and say, you understand our role, and what we need from you is you to kind of guide us through a few things and explain some things to us. We're not here and we're not going to have a confrontational process. We'd like to have this discussion. So sometimes the parties, I think in theory, or I can't say I've ever done it, but I have thought sometimes one might say to the parties, don't you really need somebody, a laboratory to analyze what went wrong with this? Don't you need some expert who's going to come in and tell us about this thing? I have never done that, but I've told in the back of my mind that maybe one day one would. I don't know, Anne and Sarah, whether that answers your question or not. But if it didn't, I'll try again.
Sarah did have, hi, Sarah, you're coming on.
Hi, yeah, that did sort of answer the question. I think it still comes down to getting the first appointment or and in terms of experience, I think certainly I can only speak for myself as a maritime arbitrator, and yes, I have worked with offshore projects and offshore contracts and construction issues of building different vessels or rigs or etc. as part of a large infrastructure project, but I don't think I could profess to say I'm truly an expert on that. So it's still a bit unclear how one actually, if one has an interest in dispute boards, and I think there is, as I understand it, a growing interest in this kind of dispute resolution, certainly in Norway, where I'm based, and offshore projects, how one actually goes about that.
Well, we do have a resource for you. We have an article that's on how to get your first dispute board appointment. So it may have some useful tips and guidance for you. I know you just mentioned Norway. We are actually talking about doing a webinar in that area, focusing on some projects. There are some users in Norway right now using dispute boards. So I know Simon Fegan is on, and that's an area that we've been talking about. Simon, did you want to comment on that?
I was actually going to comment, if I may, on Sarah, you're talking about getting your first appointment.
No, I was just, well, I wasn't talking about my first appointment. I was just thinking generally, also presumably speaking for others, that's the issue in any kind of dispute resolution work. But I think, or I assume in dispute board work, that is probably even more, whatever the right word I'm looking for is, but that is a major requirement. Whereas there are other forms of dispute resolution where you may know people and there is a certain willingness to give people an opportunity. Whereas a dispute board sounds like on a slightly different level, as you don't get the opportunity until you've got the experience, because otherwise you wouldn't be asked. And
I can only give two things on that. One is I'm a chartered surveyor by profession, but I qualified as an arbitrator. I worked in Cape Town, and I had the same issue of breaking in to a school of people who had the business. And so getting your first appointment is, I think, like many of these things, it really can be a battle, but it's a matter of perseverance and it's a matter of luck. I think there's a great deal of that. But I had the construction knowledge, so my work was all in construction. So I got into that. But the other thing I could say on that is we are in the DRBF at the moment, and I don't have the details, so I'm going to look at Anne. And I do that because her screen is that side of me, but I don't know where it is for everybody else. But we're implementing a mentoring system. We're trying to bring people in. And curiously enough, I'm not involved in the mentoring system, but since we're online, it's a lot easier to get a mentee, if that's the right word, into the room, as opposed to when we all have to, most of my work's in Africa. So if I fly out to Lusaka for a hearing, a mentee is not going to come with me. They're not going to end up paying, £700 for the airfare and a hotel bill. They're not going to get refunded through the contract because they're not part of the DB. But when we're online, it's going to cost nothing. So I believe there are systems. I also believe there are enough of us interested in actually seeing it happen that we do need younger blood. But come back to what John said, in our business, and I'm absolutely sure it's going to be in every business, including your own, you need a number of years experience in the industry you're in and an understanding of the common contracts that are used.
If I can just build on that a little bit, and just to put the purpose of this in context a little bit. I mean, there's no doubt, and you will have read and you'll know to varying degrees that there's a lot going on in the UK around the UK shipbuilding industry, and There's a lot of talk of naval ships. The fact that the Navy is going to renew its fleet. There's no provision within the National Shipbuilding Strategy for dispute boards as such, but they've gone quite a long way towards something that looks quite like a dispute board. But I think what's interesting generally is that for more than for the first time in about 30 years, there's actually some talk and discussion that UK shipbuilding may see some sort of resurgence. It may not, but I think there's more talk about it these days than there has ever been. Initially on the back of naval ships, but also with ideas around offshore wind farm support vessels, cruise, ferry, and other highly sophisticated ships, some of which are being built already in Europe, just not in the UK. So there's a lot going on in the UK shipbuilding industry at the moment, which many of us haven't seen for over 30 years. Added to that, and in sort of combination with that, you do have this offshore wind industry, and there's no doubt that it exists, and it's already huge, and the UK are market leaders in that industry at the moment, and the largest sort of offshore wind farms currently in existence are off UK waters, and the numbers are staggering, and the growth of that industry globally is staggering. And there's so the UK shipbuilding sector potentially has a role to play as this industry grows, and it's already a huge industry in Europe. Now, dispute boards, it's very sort of accepted that dispute boards are most suited to infrastructure projects, and they've stemmed from the construction industry. So logically, as we see infrastructure projects and construction work going offshore to a much larger extent as they are with offshore wind farms, it has to be an opportunity for dispute board. So that's where I'm coming from. That's where that's from my thought. That's where I see a link between the LMAA, because we're the established arbitrators and dispute resolvers in the maritime space, and that space in the offshore wind sector is certainly going to get bigger. So it's something to think about for not for all LMAA members certainly, but some, particularly those with engineering backgrounds, technical backgrounds. I mean, John has also said lawyers too. So those that are interested, it's a very interesting area potentially. So that's kind of puts a little bit into perspective the idea behind putting the LMAA and the DRBF together in this way, just to explore the ifs, whats, and hows. I think.
Speaking of that, if, what's, and hows, there are a few questions in the chat that are very practical questions. So if I can tee a couple of those up. Peter asks about whether there's a form of immunity for the members of the DB, citing the Arbitrator Immunity Act under Section 29 of the Arbitration Act of 1996. So would someone like to tackle that point?
Let me have a first go. I don't believe there is any statutory immunity, but it is a standard term of every dispute board appointment that I've seen, both in appointing and as being appointed, that subject, of course, to the usual exceptions of willful default and fraud, there'll be no action, no liability of the dispute board members.
Very good. There's also some questions about just general board administration. So Millen says, is it correct that the site meetings involving DBs are scheduled at the outset? And if so, what is the general frequency? And then question 2 is about, due to social distancing put in place because of COVID-19, how do you handle the absence of site visits? So I know the answers to both of those questions, but Simon, do you want to reply, or John?
Well, the site visits that are usually designated in the frequencies designated in the terms of the contract and the rules and procedural rules. And in FIDIC, it's top of my head, it's not less than 70 days, not more than 140. They are decided, yes, the standard procedure is that the first meeting is to decide when you're going to have them throughout the contract. They are a movable feast. They my experience, they do invariably, some of them get moved because of unscheduled events, let me put it like that. sorry, your other question.
Well, it was about virtual proceedings.
Can I just say, before you go to virtual things,
Sure.
Can I just add one thing? What is very normal in our industry is because all major projects have a schedule of site meetings between the parties and the engineer and subcontractors, etc. Dispute boards will generally try and schedule their meeting for the same day or the next day so that they don't cause people to have to travel, etc. They can kind of tag on to one of those meetings. That's good for two reasons. One is because it just avoids unnecessary time wastage, but also because very often they can pick up the issues that have arisen from the meeting that occurred a few hours before them. Sorry, so I don't interrupt. That's my procedure. Under
COVID, a lot of things drones are being very popularly being used in building work and in civil work, video. There are ways. It's been very interesting to see how certainly the construction industry has actually moved very quickly, in my view, to get used to the restrictions as they came in.
I must share that the DRBF has published a paper on the use of virtual proceedings for dispute boards, and it has a companion piece for practitioners on sort of a checklist of things to do when you're setting up a virtual regular meeting, as John talked a good bit about, and even covers a hearing scenario. We have been hosting webinars. This has obviously been an extremely hot topic for our members this year. And we're constantly compiling those lessons learned and sharing those with our members. It's been fun to hear people talk about the drones, drone footage for site visits. Some people are actually saying they find that they prefer it in some cases because they're able to instruct the drone operator to zoom in on something that they want to get a closer look at that maybe they wouldn't be able to do if they had feet on the ground on the job site. Another guy mentioned he does a lot of highway work, and he said, boy, I can see a lot more from drone footage than zooming by the project at 70 miles per hour. I'm sorry, I don't know what the kilometer conversion is for that, but you get the gist. So it's an interesting continually learning process for our members.
If I may jump in terms of process, John, you touched on several aspects. I just wanted to draw out a little bit the similarities between the process of dispute boards and arbitrators, if you like, because there are quite a few. I mean, there's obviously many differences, and the dispute avoidance aspect is unique to dispute boards, but there's also a lot of similarities, particularly when it comes to the independence and impartiality, which you mentioned, and tribunals of 1 to 3. But in terms of the nitty-gritty and the process that the dispute board goes through when they're asked to make a decision or a recommendation, it strikes me that that's actually also quite similar to the an LMAA small claims procedure. But perhaps you can just run through it in a sort of give us a 1 or 2 minute summary of a typical process.
Absolutely. A typical. Once we've got past the avoidance stage and we now have a dispute that has to be resolved in a binding, or at least binding until arbitration process, then we do need usually to have some degree of formality to make sure that each party has properly set out what their case is. I try personally very hard to avoid things that sound like arbitration. So I would certainly, wince at somebody talking about pleadings, for example, and witness statements, etc. I steer away from those. I talk about written submissions as to various issues. I often will try and get the parties to agree what the headings are going to be, that kind of thing. But yes, when you have the dare I say, hearing, it has to have a sufficient element of formality to be effective as a dispute resolving issue. But I will very often introduce myself. My name is John Busher, please call me John. And I will encourage that level of informality. As I said before, in contrast to arbitration, where we tend to have this, you have your say, then there's a reply, then he has a response, etc. on the way through the thing. I will often say, look, really important that we understand exactly where each of you are coming from. So can we just have a kind of discussion across the table? And we've got to keep it reasonably controlled. But if there's a question you have, let's put it in real time in the dialogue. Don't let's wait into some formality, by which time you've forgotten the question anyway. Let's have a dialogue about what the issues are. But then at the end of that, if you have to make a decision, you do have to step back to those submissions and produce a properly reasoned decision. And at that stage, you do get much closer to an arbitration award, because you really do have to provide the proper reasoning. And particularly when you're a standing board, because you've got to give the parties the confidence. Because usually one of them will have lost. One of them you will have found they were wrong. You've got to give that guy the confidence that he can come back another time and he sees how you work and he sees he'll get a fair shout at it. So I don't know, Ben, how far that answered your question. I do tailor these to the projects, I have to say. I do tailor them to the people in the projects. I try to have some informality, but in the end, you have to have the written material and you have to be able to step back for that reasoned decision.
No, that's great, thank you. And my understanding too is that the parties are given 28 days for a claim, 28 days for a reply, and at some point that part of the process has ended. Yeah.
I mean, the 28 days. I would form a view and I would discuss with the parties. Say you can't possibly want 28 days. Right. You've been discussing this. You know what the issue is.
And if I told you are not having ex parte dealings with either the parties, are you? You're always dealing with the parties together.
I always deal with the parties together.
No ex parte.
Exactly. No ex parte. Unlike that's one of the big contrast causes mediation. I don't go into a room with one of them and say, "What would you say about this?"
Yeah.
So Ben, we are coming up at the close of the session, and we did have one question in the chat that we haven't addressed yet that Clive asked about. So he wanted to know if there is any geographical focus where dispute boards are particularly active, and then also asked specifically about Asia. Now, I'll just answer that very quickly to say, of course, we had that slide which showed the use of dispute boards around the globe. And there are a couple of ways that they take root. One is through having people on the ground who are advocating for their use. And so we see very strong usage in the US and Australia, where we have this kind of on the ground effort. Then we also see accelerators through the standard form contracts like the FIDIC, through ICC dispute board rules and the international financing agencies. Now, that has really been a big accelerator for us, particularly in the developing world, where these financing institutions are funding the projects and requiring the use of dispute boards. Specifically in Asia, we see that happening through the really strong support of JICA, the Japanese institution that has done dispute board training and really been a strong supporter of dispute boards for all the projects they fund. We see a lot of activity in China through the international contractors. The Chinese contractors are working globally, and so they're interacting with the boards on a regular basis and are also advocates. We have a cooperation agreement with the Beijing Arbitration Center, so there certainly is some activity in China. And then in Southeast Asia, we see the energy coming through the legislative side. So in Indonesia, they have a law that allows the use of dispute boards for all their public works projects. And so we've seen a growth in the use of dispute boards in that country because of having that legal support for the process built into their institutions. So hopefully that addresses the question. In being respectful of everyone's time, I know we are at the end here, but we are happy to stay on for a few minutes and handle any follow-up questions or new questions that you'd like to raise before signing off. Clive, I hope that answers the question for you.
Yes, it does. That's a very helpful answer. Thank you.
All right, very good.
Any more questions from anyone, or are we ready to sign off? Ben, anything more you'd like to say?
No, I think well, other than a huge thank you to Anne, John, and Simon for taking the time. It's I very much hope it's piqued some interest amongst the audience and the members, and will give rise to a fruitful conversation to be had afterwards.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I echo all of that. Just very briefly, by way of closing comments, as sadly Bruce has not been able to join us because of his hearing. I think the LMAA really has something to bring to the party here. Wherever there's a complex project with something that floats. Now, this sort of dispute board mechanism is not going to be appropriate for the building of conventional ships, which are just not complex enough. But whenever there's something more complicated than that, we have a role, I think. We have full and supporting members who have expertise in major offshore construction projects and military vessels and so on. We have submariners, we have ex-naval officers among our membership. And I echo exactly what Ben said, that I think there are three obvious areas here that are particularly suitable to our expertise. One is the wind farm projects, because they take place, when they're offshore wind farms, they take place in a maritime environment. They're heavily dependent on the use of boat contracts. Military vessels, which will have complicated systems that could involve a lot of individual issues during the course of the project. And of course, complex construction of vessels, anything that floats, anything from ships and rigs to FPSOs in the offshore oil and gas industry. And picking up on a point that Simon and John both made about the expertise in contracts. I mean, it's very interesting to hear John with his specialist expertise in FIDIC, which a lot of us don't have. What I think we bring is experience in other types of contract, because of course, a lot of rig building, for example, will take place on contracts that are based on essentially shipbuilding contracts, like the Shipbuilders Association of Japan form as the starting point. And there is absolutely no doubt that in complex projects of the sort that we get involved in, there can be an impact on the delivery or completion date, because very often there's an accumulation of delay and disruption claims, which leave you in a situation where you're not even certain what the completion or delivery date is going to be. And so having a dispute board there to deal with those issues as they arise and keep the project on track is quite clearly valuable. So that's just some initial thoughts on this very first session. Congratulations to Ben for organizing this. It's tremendously interesting, and special thanks to Anne, John and Simon, and for everybody who's attending. So thanks very much. And there's Bruce. I'll hand over briefly to Bruce if he'd like to say anything.
Good time.
Shall we start again?
Well, I did put some contact details up on the screen here. So we do welcome a continuation of the conversation by email and future meetings. So don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with further questions or comments so we can help you get connected. It's really been a pleasure to be with you all here today.
Yes, thank you all for taking the time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Good night. Oh, dang.